Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm Allison Slack, Manager for Manufacturing-Related Strategic Initiatives at FuzeHub. And today we're here to learn about the power of transatlantic supply chain connections in advanced electronics industries. We hope that you'll become engaged in this initiative to make B2B connections among the advanced electronics clusters across Europe and North America, particularly New York State. This is the second in a series, perhaps the second time you're joining us. And this webinar and subsequent ones are focused on specific advanced electronics industry areas in application areas from autonomous operations to smart cities to healthcare. In this case, we're hosting a discussion about the growth of the electronics integration into medical devices, which is driven by the burgeoning digital health market and other factors. You're going to hear from New York State and European organizations with leading medical device innovations, as well as economic development organizations that are facilitating transatlantic advanced electronics business-to-business connections. FuzeHub is a nonprofit organization that connects New York's small and mid-sized manufacturing companies to resources, programs, and expertise that they need for technology commercialization, innovation, and business growth. What we do is we help companies navigate New York State's robust network of industry experts at economic development organizations, university research centers, manufacturing extension partnership centers, and other providers. In fact, FuzeHub is part of the statewide New York Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program supported by Empire State Development's Division of Science, Technology, and Innovation. We're doing this because FuzeHub is a partner of New York Loves Nanotech, which is a consortium of organizations and companies that have joined forces to promote New York and all the state has to offer to high-tech industries. For nearly 20 years, New York Loves Nanotech has had a relationship with the industry cluster organizations comprising Silicon Europe, and that in turn represents over 3,000 member companies, primarily small and mid-sized enterprises. So on this webinar, you'll learn about these groups' activities to support and promote companies in the advanced electronics ecosystem on a global level and hear from companies that have leveraged these relationships. I'd like to turn it over to Lamar Hill of Fusion Market Group to talk about the North America European Advanced Electronics Initiative.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody's having a great day. It's a little rainy here in upstate New York. But as Allison said, we're here to talk about innovation-driven technology platforms around advanced electronics and how we can enable cross-Atlantic operations so that we can support European companies that want to expand in New York and across North America, and vice versa. Our European cluster partners can help North American companies expand into Europe. So we've been, as Allison said, we've been working in terms of cross-Atlantic with various clusters on both sides of the Atlantic for the last 20 years. And we expect this to be a long-term effort and certainly extend over the next 20 years as the global advanced electronics industry continues to expand at a much faster pace than the world economy. So with that, going to the next slide, is what we're trying to create is really a network to support especially small, medium-sized enterprises as they expand and capture more market share in the various segments they're involved in. And we can, all the clusters on both sides of the Atlantic can help with some common support mechanisms. We can certainly make introductions to venture funding and private equity. We can introduce companies to the opportunities with government grants and programs. We can help connect companies to R&D assets, such as university research programs or industry university government-driven R&D centers. We can help facilitate joint ventures. We can help establish representatives. We can support workforce education, and we also organize workshops that I'll talk about in a second. So when you look at North America vis-a-vis advanced electronics, there are 8 or 9 clusters that have emerged over the last 40 years. the greater Boston area, upstate New York, Quebec in Canada, Ontario also, then the Austin, Dallas, Texas cluster, Phoenix, Arizona, Boise, Idaho, Silicon Valley, Portland, Oregon, and then there's several smaller clusters that have emerged. So we are in upstate New York. New York loves nanotech, obviously. So clearly we represent our virtues, but at the same time, we're happy to introduce any company to key cluster drivers in all those other areas. So looking at, and as Allison said, we're focused around advanced electronics. I don't want to dwell on that too long. Each of the webinars that we're doing has a theme. This one is, as Allison said, is centered around healthcare. The next one will be around smart cities and organizations and activities. After that, it will be the last one, I believe, is on. What's the last one, Allison? Well, it's in my later slide. So, in fact, it's in this slide. So we had our first actual 3-day workshop at SUNY Polytechnic in Albany, New York, in October of 2017. We had about 120 participants. It was very successful. We've scheduled a second Business Connection Forum on Monday, November 12th in Munich, Germany, and it'll be in conjunction with Semicon Europa and Electronica. So we'll have a workshop Monday afternoon from 2 to 5 or so with a social event afterwards. And then we'll encourage business-to-business meetings to happen during the Semicon Europa Electronica Trade Fair the rest of the week. We also have two more webinars that we plan. One for September 13th on smart cities and smart activities and smart organizations. And then we have our fourth one, October 18th, on energy systems. So I would encourage all of you to participate and get involved, and we'll help make connections.
Thank you, Lamar. And this is Allison. I neglected to mention that there is a questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll do Q&A at the end, but you're welcome to submit questions through there at any point. I encourage you to do so, and we'll collect them and address them at the end. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Johan Lecoq. He's from DSP Valley, one of the advanced electronics cluster organizations in Europe, and he's here to represent the Silicon Europe Alliance. Johan.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning to all of you listening from the US, and I would say good afternoon to those listening from European side. And as Lamar was saying, it's apparently raining there. I would say I'm happy to send some of the hot weather we are having today here in Europe, so over 37 degrees Celsius today, which is quite hot. So as Alison was saying, my name is Johan Lecoq from DSP Valley. DSP Valley is cluster in Belgium and is also one of the founding members of Silicon Europe. And Silicon Europe is really, as the name is saying, a European initiative where we have a collaboration of European clusters active in advanced electronics. And this initiative was taken end of 2015. So we are existing now for a little bit more than 2.5 years. So maybe you can go to the next slide. Our main ambition as an alliance was, and I would say still is, of course, is to foster the cooperation and innovation across Europe. So what we have established in regional initiatives, we want to extend that to an European level. And so we want to support all our members, which are in fact companies, larger companies, SMEs, research institutes, and universities to accelerate their R&D and business connections, which in fact at the end is a main task of a network organization. And in that role, we are also well positioned to represent the European micro and nano electronics industry, and certainly the SMEs. And I can also say that this is also exactly the reason while we as Silicon Europe on that level, we are setting up the collaboration with organizations like the Center of Economic Growth, New York Labs, Nanotech, or FuzeHub, because we all believe, and I think Lamar very well explained, that this kind of collaboration can help to create what I would call a kind of an international framework which can stimulate and support companies and organizations on both sides of the ocean to explore, you can say, cross-Atlantic business collaborations. And yeah, this webinar and the business connection forums, Lamar was very well explaining that, are part of the activities we can develop on that level. Maybe you can go to the next slide, Alison. Okay, today, so in 2015, we started with 5 European clusters. In the meantime, we have grown to 12 clusters. So this means today the Silicon Europe Alliance has 12 clusters which are really collaborating. They are all active in what we today call advanced electronics or digital technologies, microelectronics, photonics, ICT, whatsoever. It all has to do with advanced high-tech electronic stuff. The names you can see on the slide, but if you go to the next slide, then you also can see how they are located in Europe. And then you see that at least today, we already succeed to cover most of the Western European part. And hopefully, and that's what we are currently discussing, that we can extend our alliance to also cover part of the Nordic regions and part of Eastern Europe, such that after a couple of years, we can say we really represent the whole of Europe. And maybe I think now we have the last slide, I guess. I don't know. Yes. Okay, this is just again showing what we are representing. Currently over 2,500, maybe it's already going in the direction of 3,000 members, which are mainly SMEs, but also having a lot of research institutes from the most famous in Europe and many of the large companies. So said that, if you want to get in touch with this industry in Europe, Silicon Europe can really act as I would say, a first entrance point and a representative of these companies. So be welcome to contact us.
Thanks, Johan. So next we'll hear from Winthrop Thurlow, who is the Executive Director of MedTech here in New York State. It's an association of biomedical companies and organizations and has really helped to boost the success of that industry here in New York State. Win? I think you may be on mute, Win.
Is that better?
There we go.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Allison, and good morning, all. As Allison indicated, MedTech is an association of companies and academic institutions in the state of New York, primarily focused in the upstate New York region. We had our start as a collection of device manufacturers primarily located in the central New York Finger Lakes region, and since that time we've grown really to encompass all of New York State. I noticed with particular interest one of the slides early on showing some of the other existing clusters, and one thing that I like to point out as we look at other clusters in the United States and North America generally, what you will find is, as you look at a map, is that upstate New York really serves as a great connector between other clusters that already exist. So to the extent that there are established clusters of medtech companies in the Cambridge and Boston area, in Toronto, in Cleveland, in the Pittsburgh areas, really the connector between all of those places is right across upstate New York. And Certainly with respect to advanced electronics, increasingly our members, particularly members like Welch Allyn, that is now a subsidiary of Hill-Rom, and ConMed and some others, are relying on the use of advanced electronics in their devices. Our role, in many ways similar to what FuzeHub does at its end, is to connect our members, to educate our members, and to allow them to collaborate with one another and look for new opportunities. So from our perspective, we are very interested in being able to push out information like this and connect our members to some of the other participants on this webinar. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I could talk all morning about MedTech, but I'll stop for there and see if we can answer any particular questions you might have.
Thanks, Wynn. Yes, again, you can submit questions through the portal in the control panel there, and we'll hold them until the end. And now we're going to hear from a representative of IMEC. IMEC, if you're not familiar, is a leading international R&D and innovation hub that's active particularly in the fields of nanoelectronics and digital technologies. It is based in Europe, in Belgium, however has offices all over the world, and Sunil Gangadharan will be joining us to tell you of some of IMEC's capabilities in this. He is in fact based in Boston. Sunil.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Alison. I hope you can all hear me. Good morning, everyone, those who've dialed in. Thank you for this opportunity, Alison, to present at this webinar. Again, I'm Sunil Gangadharan and based in Boston. I manage strategic partnerships for IMEC, which is based in Leuven. Again, it's my pleasure to introduce IMEC and the breadth of transatlantic partnerships that we've been involved in and aspire to be in the future. Next slide, please. So IMEC is headquartered in Leuven in Belgium. It's known for carrying out cutting-edge micro and nanoelectronics R&D for the past 3 decades, working with key industrial partners across the value chain and academia from all over the world, across a variety of industries, delivering industry-relevant tech solutions. IMEC is doing this R&D by leveraging both global talent and really state-of-the-art semiconductor fabrication infrastructure. We are primarily located in Leuven. Our headquarters and major infrastructure is located there, but we have R&D centers in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and we have opened an R&D center with 60 employees in Osceola County, Florida, in the United States. This is especially important, in terms of fostering our partnerships, especially those partnerships where government-funded programs are involved. We also have a large partnerships team based in Silicon Valley, as one would expect. Next slide, please. So IMEC has set up 3 large technology R&D platforms. So if you start from the lower left-hand corner of the slide, our semiconductor and systems technologies platform comprises advanced research on process technology for chip miniaturization, sensor technologies, and technologies for flexible electronics. So some of these technology platforms actually push forward and enable new opportunities, beyond our traditional nanoelectronics boundaries. We combine these semiconductor and system technologies with our knowledge on networking, digital privacy and security, and software and data management skills to create really groundbreaking innovation in application domains that span across health, smart health, smart cities, mobility, logistics, manufacturing, and energy. So if you go to the next slide, you'll realize that beyond the R&D platforms, next slide, yeah. Beyond these R&D platforms that we have, we also offer a single point of contact into the IC value chain, providing foundry access to over 300 small and medium-scale enterprises and 700 universities. Our tapeouts have reached over 500 IC designs per year. The next slide shows you a bird's eye view of IMEC R&D facilities in Leuven. Besides the semiconductor fabs, both the 200 millimeter and 300 millimeter pilot lines, we also have dedicated labs for application domains like life science technologies and medical technologies. As you will see, for example, in the next slide, IMEC provides a fairly comprehensive offering to its partners in life sciences and medtech with capabilities in silicon chip processing, electronics, materials research, and more importantly, multidisciplinary teams of engineers and biomedical experts. Next slide. So as you can see, we provide a variety of services under one roof. Our engagements are typically bilateral, development on demand type of engagements, and it could start from very early R&D, as one would see, for example, in universities, but then beyond what you could get at universities, it goes all the way to low volume manufacturing. In many cases, partners have come to us with a concept that IMEC can help develop and then prototype them before transitioning them to a high volume manufacturing foundry if required. And we have these networks in place. The next slide, please. So what is driving the use of silicon-based technologies these days is a demand for ever smarter and connected medical devices. And IMEC is increasingly involved in this space and has several transatlantic partnerships ongoing. So for example, in the next slide, you'll see that in the field of DNA sequencing, for instance, we have a great example of a transatlantic partnership with US companies. This is a partnership that we had with the Pacific Biosensors company of California. And this is an example of a development on demand or DoD type of partnership, as we call it. In this particular case, IMEC fabricated a very highly integrated and disposable smart DNA sequencing chip for their sequel system, and made this chip really smaller, faster, and eventually it delivers really high quality sequencing results. The next slide, please. And similarly, for our partner Genelite, that's based in San Diego, we developed and delivered a disposable biosensor chip at the heart of their Maverick diagnostic system. If you can move to the next slide. So we also make custom sensors based on customer needs, and here is an example of a hyperspectral imaging sensor that's useful in imaging guidance during surgery. Another example of a US partnership is shown on the next slide, where with biotelemetry, we have developed a FDA-approved clinical grade device for patient monitoring, providing both hardware and software solutions. And in the next slide, you will actually see to the top right-hand corner, a picture of their mobile cardiac and outpatient telemetry device. And lower to that, you'll see an example of a cuffless blood pressure monitor on their SIMBAND platform for Samsung. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we have also worked on transatlantic consortiums that consist of research foundations, where we have, in this case, developed a really miniaturized, high-resolution neuroprobe that's actually pushing now the frontiers of brain research. And we have delivered several prototypes of this neuroprobe to research institutes all over the world. So, and in the next slide. So beyond all the bilateral partnerships that IMEC is involved in, we are also involved in supporting startups and early stage companies by fostering their formation, and especially in digital technology through our iStart accelerator, and further by investing in the IMEC Expand Fund, where expand funded companies have access to IMEC technology. And so if you go to the next slide, besides all of these kinds of interactions, you will also see that we have interacted on DARPA projects. So we have also involved in working on US government agency projects. And we have also worked with several expand funded companies as well in the US. And so I'd like to conclude by just inviting all of those who are dialed in to, you can see this on the next slide. I'd like to invite all of you to IMEC's Technology Forum. It's a series that we organize annually. We have one that's focused on health, And this is going to be held in San Francisco on October 19th. So thank you all for your attention. Please feel free to reach out and to learn more about IMEC. And if there are specific areas that you'd like to work in, we could always have our team provide you a deep dive into the technologies that you can access. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sunil. Okay, I actually am going to interrupt for a moment to field a couple of questions. This one is for Lamar Hill. The questioner says, you mentioned a number of clusters in the United States, but have not mentioned the Seattle region, even though it's not purely electronic. Lamar, you want to talk about the Pacific Northwest?
Sure. Well, when we talk about advanced electronics, I'm a hardware guy, so I focus on, hardware assets associated with advanced electronics, which in many cases the fundamental platform for which is semiconductors. But when you look at advanced electronics as hardware and software, that would certainly expand the number of clusters that we could talk about in North America, to include Seattle and Vancouver, the Carolinas, Florida, Michigan, and the Chicago, the Illinois area. There's probably 20 clusters around North America that, if you included both advanced electronics and IT and hardware, would be involved. So I certainly don't want to exclude any region that thinks of itself as an advanced electronics region. The list I presented was more oriented around hardware.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Wynn, we have a question for you. Somebody from the Grenoble cluster in Europe mentions that they will have a delegation with a booth and reception at the MedTech conference in Philadelphia in September. I'm actually not sure if that's yours, but the questioner is curious if you will be there and if any member companies or directors will be in Philadelphia in September.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually, that is different. Our name, in many ways, I wish our name wasn't MedTech, because there are some others. But the MedTech, we often attend MedTech, that conference, but it is not part of our association. So I would love to, I'd love to connect with others who are participating on this call and find ways that we can work together, even if we don't meet in Philadelphia in the fall.
Okay, thanks. I thought that might be the case. One more question before we move on to our next presenter. Beyond this webinar, how is the Silicon Europe organization and the associated clusters collaborating with medical device technology owners and their outside partners in design, development, and manufacturing? It is a fairly large ecosystem leveraged to deliver next generation finished medical devices to healthcare. And the questioner is interested in any plans for this type of outreach specific to the medical technologies segment. I think I'm throwing that to Lamar, but anybody else is welcome to jump in.
Well, since it refers to Silicon Europe, I can certainly answer that in terms of North America. I mean, there's a couple dozen research universities. There's some regional organizations like WIMS at MedTech spread out across the U.S. So there's a pretty good support mechanism for medical device innovations. But it was directed to the Silicon Europe cluster. So maybe perhaps Johan and/or Sunil could take a crack at this one.
Okay, I can, Johan Lecoq here, I can try to give an answer to that. So what we see on the Silicon Europe level is that when we talk about medical advanced developments, it all depends also on the individual clusters. So we don't have something like what you call an advanced high-tech medical program on Silicon Europe level. Typical some clusters like the Grenoble area, also like the Belgium area, so where DSP Valley is from, we see many activities related to medtech. And I think today I have heard one of the examples, IMEC, research institutes based in Belgium, but with activities all over the world, just more or less representing the state of the art of what is medtech and medtech advanced development, in fact, represented in Europe, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Johan. All right, we're going to move on to our final presenter, Ben Miller, who is with the University of Rochester Medical Center, a leading researcher there, and also affiliated with a company called Ortho-Clinical Diagnostics, and I believe he's going to speak about that innovation. Ben, thank you.
Thank you. Glad to have the opportunity to present a little bit on the collaborative project that we're doing with a number of different companies, including Ortho-Clinical Diagnostics, focused on developing the next generation of diagnostics using photonic biosensors. If I could have the next slide, please. So the way we approach this is thinking about sensors as the interface between the world and data. If you think about any big data applications, that data has to come from someplace. It has to come from our analog world, and the way we're going to get at that is with a sensor. Next slide, please. So the prototype way that everyone, let's see, could I have the next slide, please? So the prototype that many of us are familiar with for sensing is the tricorder, right? That was the vision in the 1960s for a medical analytical device that would be easy to analyze human health. But you know, when we look at this, it's a large, heavy thing. It's got a CRT as the output, and Spock, unfortunately, has one device for sensing and another for communication. So I think one of the exciting things about this area is that science fiction wasn't imaginative enough, and we're moving well beyond things that people had imagined at that time. Next slide, please. So in the sensing arena is one where we can apply technology to a wide range of different market spaces, all the way from very high volume, low cost applications in the consumer space, like sensors that are embedded in your appliances or in your iPhone, through mid-level applications that are more value-added, such as clinical laboratory assays, point-of-care medical assays, which is a rapidly increasing area, and on to lower volume but potentially higher margin applications, including military applications, whether that's analyzing whether your airplane is right side up or not, or assessing whether your soldiers in the field have the right level of readiness based on health metrics. Next slide, please. So if you look at this from a market analysis or a market pull standpoint, you get a lot of different numbers in terms of how large the global photonic sensors market actually is. But I think there's universal agreement that this is quite large and a rapidly expanding opportunity. This is one market forecast from a couple of years ago that was predicting a $15.2 billion market by 2020. Next slide, please. Another market research projected this as being about 21 billion for biosensors alone by 2020. So again, although there is some disagreement about exactly how large the market is in terms of a number, it's recognized that it is a large and rapidly growing opportunity. Next slide, please. So what is a biosensor, and how do we work with this in integrated photonics? Basically what we have is an optically responsive material. That's at the upper part of the slide. That sort of light blue square is a cartoon of an optically responsive material to which we've attached some sort of capture molecule, like a DNA strand or an antibody. When an analyte of interest binds to that capture molecule, you generate a signal, and that can be anything from an intensity change, a spectral signature, or a shift in a spectral feature, all of which can be readily detected and quantified to indicate the presence of an analyte, whether that's a chemical analyte or a biological analyte. Next slide, please. So where this gets to be really exciting is that optical biosensors, and particularly integrated photonic biosensors, enable applications that are otherwise impossible. If we look at metrics of human health, we're familiar with the typical things that one analyzes in a blood test. You know, you go to the doctor and your doctor says for you to go to the clinical lab and have a blood draw, and that blood draw will then report back on a couple of things in a week or so. For example, maybe cholesterol, maybe the level of some marker protein for cardiovascular health. But we know that biology is much more complicated than that. On the left of this slide is a representation of the network of proteins that are involved in cancer. So it's the cancer signaling map for humans. And just imagine if we could detect and quantify all of those at once from that same blood sample. So rather than one or two things, hundreds of things from a droplet of blood. Next slide, please. So sensors allow us to do that by having individual sensor elements functionalized with different capture elements, so different antibodies or DNA sequences. We can, for the first time in one device, detect and quantify many things as easily as one thing. And that's true whether we're talking about biological things or chemical things, and this all scales. Next slide, please. So we can do everything from small molecules to viruses and everything in between. And I'll say that in our lab and with our collaborators, we've done all of these. Next slide. So the framework that we're using to develop this is driven by AIM Photonics, which is a very large public-private collaborative effort to develop photonics manufacturing in the United States. It's part of the National Centers for Manufacturing Innovation that was started by President Obama and has continued under President Trump. And is also supported quite heavily by New York State in terms of providing an opportunity for this industry to grow in the region. Next slide, please. The project that we work on is led by us at the University of Rochester, but involves a number of different academic institutions, two different Department of Defense laboratories, that's the Naval Research Laboratory and the Army Edgewood Center for Biology and Chemical Weapons, as well as a number of companies, Orthoclinical Diagnostics, IBM, Analog Photonics, which is a Massachusetts photonics house, Lockheed Martin, and others who are all interested in taking these devices and turning them into products. Next slide, please. So the specific type of sensor that we're working on in a biological context is called a ring resonator. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this, but basically it uses the same principle that you might have discovered for yourself when standing in a dome of, say, the Capitol building or St. Paul's Cathedral, which is that picture at left, in that if you whisper, someone on the opposite side of the whispering gallery of the dome can hear what you're saying. We can do the same thing with light in that if we have a photonic device consisting of a waveguide, a very small pipe for light, and then another photonic structure called a ring resonator, just a circle of photonic structure next to that. For most wavelengths of light, it will pass directly through the waveguide. That's the central image. But for some, at a particular wavelength, light will couple into the ring and circulate thousands or even millions of times before going back out into the waveguide. And that then becomes a very sensitive probe of its environment. So on the next slide, if we have a ring that is functionalized with something that can capture a molecule of interest, what we see is that the spectrum from that ring, that's in the center of this slide, will have a feature that shifts when the thing that we want to detect binds. So that's something that can be measured and quantified, and all of this can be put into a device that is tiny, smaller than a penny, as you'll see in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So with AIM Photonics, what we do is we work with a photonic design kit that's a set of abstractions that the AIM Foundry has available for design. Designs then go into a multi-project wafer process, which is many different designers incorporating their projects into one wafer run that reduces cost overall for making these things. And then after the chips are made, we bring them back here to Rochester and our test assembly and packaging facility to turn those into devices that we can test. Next slide, please. So the foundry is in Albany. That's AIM Photonics' large nanotech complex, which is a very large, very capable silicon photonics foundry. And next slide, please. That has allowed us to make devices that, for example, are able to detect tiny amounts of material like interleukin-6. That's one protein that we're interested in detecting. It's a biomarker for inflammation, even in the presence of the total protein content of human plasma, which is on the order of 70 to 80 mg per mil, so a 10 to the 8th difference. Next slide, please. So I'll show you just briefly some reference data showing this actually works. I mentioned human interleukin-6. That's one marker for inflammation in the human body. Another that is an FDA-approved assay that we're just mimicking in one of our chips is human C-reactive protein. It's another cardiovascular marker. And on the next slide, I have an image of one of our chips. This is a ring resonator chip fabricated at AIM Photonics. It's sitting on top of a penny, so you have a little bit of an idea of the scale. So we can put many different structures on one chip, and each of these could be used to detect a different marker. The image at right is just showing some of the spectral information that comes out of one of these chips as we're looking at, in this case, C-reactive protein binding to our probe molecule on the chip. So that shows our shift in the spectral feature. Of course, for a doctor or any user looking at this, they would just get an output that says, yes, the protein's present and here's how much of it is there. They wouldn't see this level of detail, but this is what we need in order to characterize the device. Next slide, please. So this is just showing a concentration-dependent run for both C-reactive protein and interleukin-6. And what we see is that we can detect down to 10 picograms per milliliter in human serum with one of these ring resonator chips. And that is putting us right at the level of state-of-the-art for any currently available diagnostic assay, but now doing it in a small integrated photonic chip-based format. Next slide, please. So what we think we have is a technology that can go all the way from home applications to benchtop devices, point of care, point of need, to high volume clinical laboratories, which I think is another thing that is really unique to this particular industry, and that you can scale across very different kinds of markets using the same technology. And so that's what we hope will continue to demonstrate with AIM Photonics and help companies in the state of New York bring to market. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, I've given you a very quick overview, I think, showing that integrated sensors are a large and rapidly growing market. The potential devices that we can make range from high volume, low cost to low volume and high value. In the biosensing context, we're enabling applications that really were not possible. And in tandem with advances in biology, I think that's going to drive new kinds of diagnostics, also new opportunities for theranostics, so a diagnostic that's tied to a particular therapy. And we believe we're making excellent progress in realizing this vision, working with AIM Photonics and with our corporate, academic, and Department of Defense partners. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Fantastic. So I wanted to highlight that I wanted to thank Ben for talking about AIM Photonics and highlighting how Orthoclinical Diagnostics has been able to collaborate with that institute on an R&D project. And for those listening from the US side, if you don't know, AIM Photonics is one of 14 Manufacturing USA institutes supported by the Department of Defense in the case of AIM Photonics, and some of them are supported by the Department of Energy at a federal level and matched by engagement from the private sector and academia. Those institutes are each focused on a different technology segment affecting the future of American manufacturing competitiveness. There are institutes focused on a whole range of areas, including robotics, smart manufacturing, digital manufacturing, additive manufacturing, advanced composites, chemical process intensification, flexible hybrid electronics. I won't name them all, but these are significant investments by the U.S. manufacturing community. And I wanted to let everybody know that between FuzeHub and the rest of the New York Manufacturing Extension Partnership, we have a number of staff dedicated to helping transition the technologies that are coming out of these institutes into the U.S. manufacturing base, small manufacturers in particular, and also to involve small manufacturers in informing the R&D agendas of these institutes and participating in projects like the one that Ben described. So encourage you to get in touch with us at fusehub.com if you're looking to understand more about that network and get connected. Okay, we have a couple of questions. In the medical segments addressed, what is the level of importance of small micro batteries or some sort of energy storage to power the devices? I'm going to guess the answer is high, but if any panelists would like to jump in and characterize that and perhaps talk about the current status of that and limitations that are important to overcome right now. Everybody is welcome to talk at once.
So I'll jump in, this is Ben. So I think that certainly for any of the applications that I discussed where you're looking for a point of care or point of need device, something that's going to be out in the field, that's going to be very important. One of the things that we think is attractive about integrated photonics is that because they are relatively low power, they can take advantage of a small power source and still be useful.
I'd like to jump in as well. This is Sunil. So IMEC has been working on low power solutions for a long time as well. And we're also working on solid state kind of batteries that provide the kind of power sources that are required for these kind of point of care and small wearable devices. Folks are welcome to come and check out what IMEC has been working on in that area.
This is Lamar. Actually, we have our fourth webinar is going to be on advanced electronics and energy applications. And we will certainly have a few organizations that are working on portable power weigh in as part of that webinar. So that's coming up in a couple months. But the answer is pretty straightforward. Yes, we need more efficient, higher capacity, portable power.
Okay, thank you. That concludes our questions. So I wanted to emphasize that, you know, everybody you heard from today, their contact information is on the screen. All these people can be are good first stops, good connection points to taking the next step of, they can all refer you to a number of companies and organizations in your space, in your innovation space. So we hope that you use them as ombudsmen as you look to get engaged. I mentioned the future webinars, excuse me, here we go. So the next webinar we'll have in this series is Thursday, September 13th. If you're on the US East Coast, it's at 9 o'clock again. This is the same time slot for each of these, 3 p.m. over in Central European Standard Time. And the fourth webinar that Lamar just mentioned will focus on advanced electronics and energy systems. That will be Thursday, October 18th. 9 o'clock US Eastern Time, 3 o'clock for those in Europe. So I wanted to just remind you that FuzeHub is here as a nonprofit organization to help companies navigate resources like the ones you heard from today at various institutes, universities, and throughout our network of manufacturing extension partnership centers that are specifically charged with assisting small manufacturers with competitiveness. And the slides from today will be available on the website starting tomorrow. They will also be emailed to all participants who registered with their email address. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We're very excited to present this series. Please stop in at www.fuzehub.com if you have any follow-up questions. And I will leave this slide up with everyone's contact information for a few minutes. Thank you so much for joining us.